The house at 14 Elderberry Lane had never been just a house. Calvin Hargrove had understood that from the beginning. He bought the land in 1987 with money saved from 7 years of working double shifts at the county highway department, driving home in the dark with calloused hands and a quiet kind of satisfaction that Dorothea always said was his most attractive quality. He poured the concrete for the back patio himself in the summer of 1991, sweating through 3 weekends in August, while Dorothea brought him lemonade and their children played in the yard behind him. He repainted the front porch every 4 years without being asked. He replaced the roof in 2008 after a storm took half of it, negotiating with the contractor, until Dorothea had to pull him away from the phone. He replaced the water heater, rewired the kitchen, rebuilt the fence after the ice storm of 2014. 35 years of decisions. 35 years of Saturday mornings spent maintaining something worth maintaining. Dorothea Hargrove understood all of this. She understood it the way you understand things that have been part of your life so long, they stop feeling like choices and start feeling like the shape of existence itself. The house was where Calvin had lived. It was where he had died 14 months ago, in the bedroom at the end of the hall with Dorothea holding his hand and the hospice nurse sitting quietly in the corner. It was where his chair still sat by the living room window, the armrest worn smooth on the right side from 30 years of use. It was not simply property. It was the physical record of a man's life well spent. And Dorothea had never once thought she might lose it. That was the first thing. That was where everything began. She dressed for church that Sunday morning in October the way she always did, moving through the familiar choreography of the bedroom with the practiced ease of a woman who had been performing the same ritual for decades. She chose the navy blue cardigan without thinking about it, the one Calvin had given her for their anniversary 7 years ago, the one he always said made her eyes look the color of Lake Erie in the fall. She picked up her Bible from the nightstand, the one with the worn spine and the water stain on the back cover from a trip to Gatlinburg in 1989, and she tucked it under her arm and walked downstairs. Brendan was in the kitchen. Her son sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open in front of him, a mug of coffee near his right hand, still wearing the gray sweatshirt he had slept in. He was 41 years old, and he had his father's jaw and his grandmother's eyes, and he had been living in the house on Elderberry Lane for the past 8 months since Dorothea had agreed that having someone around during the adjustment period made sense. Those had been his words. The adjustment period, as if grief were a phase you pass through on your way to something easier. Sylvia stood at the kitchen sink with her back to the room. Brendan's wife was 38 with dark hair she kept pulled back on weekend mornings, and she had a way of occupying space that made Dorothea feel without any specific evidence that she was an inconvenience in her own kitchen. But that morning Dorothea noticed something else. On the laptop screen in front of Brendan, between the open tabs she could not quite read, she caught a brief flash of what looked like a banking portal. Numbers. A progress bar of some kind. She did not stop. She did not ask. She told herself she was imagining things that Brendan handled the online bills now because he had offered to, and she had been grateful. And there was nothing unusual about a man looking at a banking website on a Sunday morning. She told herself that, and she moved past the table and kissed Brendan on the top of his head and said goodbye. Sylvia did not turn around. Dorothea noticed that too. She filed it away in the place where she kept the small things that did not quite fit, and she walked out into the October morning and got into her car. She looked back at the house before she pulled out of the driveway. It was something she had started doing in the months after Calvin died, a habit she could not explain, as if the house might change in her absence, and she needed a fixed image to return to. The front porch was the same. The flower beds needed tending. The flag Calvin had mounted beside the front door in 2003 moved in the light morning wind. Brendan had appeared in the kitchen window. He was looking out holding his coffee mug. He did not wave. Dorothea pulled out of the driveway and drove toward First Methodist Church, where she had worshiped for 30 years, where Calvin's memorial service had been held, where the Reverend Harold Stokes still called her by her first name and always asked after her health with what seemed like genuine concern. She drove the 12 minutes through quiet Sunday streets, and she sat through the service, and she sang the hymns she knew by heart, and she felt, as she always did in those pews, something close to peace. She was still holding that feeling when she turned onto Elderberry Lane at 11:52 in the morning and pulled into her own driveway and took her key from her purse and walked up to her own front door and put the key into the lock. It did not turn. She tried again. The key entered the lock with no resistance, but when she applied pressure, nothing happened. She withdrew it, checked that she had the right key, which she knew she did because it was the only key on the ring, and she tried a third time. Nothing. That was when she looked at the lock itself. It was new, completely unmistakably new. The metal was bright and unscratched, the kind of shine that only belongs to hardware that has never been used. The old lock, the one she had had on the door since 2001, when a neighbor's house was broken into and Calvin had decided to upgrade the deadbolt, had been a warm brass-colored dull from 2 decades of daily contact. This lock was silver. This lock had been installed while she was sitting in church singing hymns and feeling something close to peace. Dorothea stood on her own front porch and looked at her own front door for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then she looked at the porch itself. Her green rolling suitcase was there, the one she used for trips to visit Nora in Portland. Her walking shoes, the pair she kept in the hall closet. The box of family photographs she kept on the shelf above the fireplace, the ones that stretched from her wedding in 1979 to last Christmas. They were arranged neatly, not thrown out, but placed, which told her something important about the person who had done this. Someone had taken time. Someone had wanted it to look civil. She was still standing there, still processing the geometry of this moment, when she noticed the edge of white paper beneath the welcome mat, not sticking out carelessly. Placed deliberately with enough of the corner visible that she would find it, but not so visible that anyone passing would notice. She bent down and picked it up. The envelope had her name on it in handwriting she recognized before her mind had time to identify why, the way you recognize a piece of music before you can name the song. The recognition hit her somewhere below the level of thought, somewhere in the body, and it moved through her like cold water. Irene Hargrove had been dead for 6 years. Dorothea had held her sister's hand in the hospital in Cincinnati on a Tuesday night in October, the same month of year, and Irene had squeezed back with less and less force until there was no force at all. Dorothea had spoken at the funeral. She had helped their mother sort through Irene's belongings the following spring. She had kept a box of Irene's letters on the shelf in her bedroom closet. Letters written over 40 years of sisterhood, and she knew that handwriting with the intimacy of someone who had read it hundreds of times. The way Irene made the letter E with a slight leftward tilt. The way the final stroke of the lowercase R curved upward into a small hook. Tiny habits of the hand invisible to anyone who had not spent a lifetime reading them. Dorothea knew she was not imagining it. The handwriting on the envelope was Irene's. She stood completely still on the porch, and she did not move for a long time. Then the curtain in the living room window shifted. Brendan was standing behind the glass. She could see him clearly, his posture, the way he had carried himself since he was a teenager, the slight forward lean when he was trying to read a situation. He was watching her. He was not reaching for the door handle. He was not mouthing her name through the glass. He was simply watching with an expression she could not fully read at that distance, but which she would describe later to Winifred Osgood as the face of a man observing a procedure he had already set in motion. Dorothea did not knock. Something in her, some instinct that bypassed the part of her brain still trying to construct a reasonable explanation for all of this, told her not to. She looked at Brendan through the glass. He looked back at her. Then she dropped her eyes to the envelope and she opened it. The note inside was short, no greeting, no signature, just 4 lines in Irene's handwriting. Do not trust the person closest to you. Do not knock again. Go to your car. Check the glove compartment. You do not have as much time as you think. She read it once, then again, then a third time slower, the way you read something when the words are simple but the meaning keeps expanding. When she looked up, Sylvia had appeared in the window beside Brendan. The two of them stood there together watching her. Sylvia's arms were crossed. Her expression was calm in a way that Dorothea would spend the next week trying to find the right word for. Not cold exactly, not hostile, calm in the way of a person who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the consequences to arrange themselves in the expected order. Dorothea folded the note carefully and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in her purse. She picked up her Bible from where she had set it down on the porch railing. She turned and walked toward her car, and she did not look back at the window. She was almost to the driveway when she stopped. For a moment, she stood on the front path between the house and the car, feeling the October sun on her shoulders, hearing the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower, and she made a decision that she would later understand was the first real decision of what was about to become the most important period of her life. She would not knock. She would not demand explanations. She would go to the car. She trusted the note. She trusted the handwriting. The glove compartment stuck slightly when she opened it the way it always did in cold weather, and she had to pull it twice before it came open fully. Registration papers, insurance documents, the old pair of sunglasses she had been looking for since July, and on the inside panel of the compartment door, attached with a thin strip of clear tape, a small black flash drive. It was wrapped in a piece of folded paper. The handwriting on the paper was different from the envelope. This handwriting was angular and precise, nothing like Irene's gentle loops. It said, "If they move sooner than expected, this is your proof. Do not confront them yet. You need to understand everything first." Dorothea sat with the flash drive in her palm and the note in her other hand, and she looked through her windshield at the front of her house, at the new lock, at the neatly arranged belongings on the porch, at the window where Brendan and Sylvia had been standing, the curtain now fallen back into place. She started the car and drove away. She was 3 blocks from Elderberry Lane when she saw Marguerite Stanton. Her neighbor was in her front yard, 72 years old, with white hair and the careful movements of someone who knows her hips are not what they were, crouching over a flower bed with a small trowel. Midge had lived across the street from Dorothea for 23 years. She had attended Calvin's funeral. She had brought soup over during that first brutal winter of Dorothea's widowhood, appearing at the door without being asked the way good neighbors do. Dorothea pulled to the curb and lowered her window. Midge saw her and stood slowly, and the expression on her face when she recognized Dorothea was complicated in a way that Dorothea's stomach immediately registered as wrong. "I do not want to get in the middle of anything," Midge said, coming to the car. "But Dorothea, I think you should know, Brendan came to see me yesterday." "What did he say?" Midge pressed her lips together briefly. "He said you have been having some difficulties, forgetting things, signing papers and then not remembering signing them." She paused. "He said he was worried about you, that he was trying to step in and help before things got worse." Dorothea sat very still in the driver's seat. "And he wanted you to know this," she said. "He did not phrase it quite like that, but yes, he was telling me before." Midge stopped. "Before I came and told you something different." Midge did not answer, which was answer enough. Dorothea looked at her neighbor, this woman she had known for 2 decades. This woman who had watched Dorothea plant tulip bulbs in the fall and shovel snow in the winter and wave from the driveway on 100 ordinary mornings. Midge, she said, how long have you known me? Going on 23 years. And in that time, have you ever seen me sign something I did not understand? Midge was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think you should talk to Brendan. I appreciate you telling me, Dorothea said. She raised the window and pulled back onto the street. Her hands were steady on the wheel. Her breathing was controlled. But something had shifted beneath the steadiness. Something she would spend the next several hours learning to name. What Brendan had done, she now understood, was not something that had started that morning. He had not woken up on a Sunday and decided to change the locks and send his mother to the porch with her suitcase. He had been building toward this. He had been preparing the ground, talking to neighbors, constructing a story about a confused elderly woman who needed to be managed, planting seeds of doubt in the people around her. One conversation at a time, so that when Dorothea came to them and said something is wrong, the response would already be shaped. This had been going on for longer than she could currently see. She drove to Winifred Osgood's house. Winifred, who everyone called Win, had been Dorothea's closest friend for 22 years. They had met in the teacher's lounge at Westview Elementary, where Dorothea taught 3rd grade and Win taught music during a particularly grim parent-teacher conference week in November of 2002. They had survived the deaths of their husbands within 18 months of each other. They had the kind of friendship that does not require explanation, where you can show up at someone's door looking like the world has tilted sideways, and the only question asked is whether you want coffee first or conversation first. Win opened the door before Dorothea reached it. She took one look at her friend's face and stepped aside without saying anything. Dorothea sat down at the kitchen table and told her everything in order without dramatics. The key, the lock, the suitcase on the porch, the envelope with Irene's handwriting, the note, the flash drive, the conversation with Midge. It took less than 12 minutes, and when she finished, she set the flash drive on the table between them. Win looked at it, then she got up and retrieved her laptop from the desk in the corner. The drive contained a single folder with no name. Inside the folder were 3 types of files: documents, audio recordings, one video. The first document was titled Account Transfers, Hargrove Household. It was a spreadsheet, dates going back 14 months, amounts most of them in the range of a few hundred to a few $1,000s. Descriptions: household support, emergency repair, medical adjustment, temporary access. And Dorothea, looking at each line, felt something happen inside her that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with memory. Because she recognized every date, not because she had seen these transactions before, but because each date matched an event she remembered. There was the date Brendan had told her the air conditioning unit was failing, and he needed to move money quickly to cover the service call. She remembered sitting at the kitchen table while he handled the phone. Remembered the technician she had never quite seen up close, remembered being told was taken care of. She had never seen the receipt. There was the date Sylvia's car had needed emergency brake work. There was the date Brendan said the property tax escrow had come up short and required a temporary rebalancing. Every story had a date. Every date had a dollar amount. And the amounts were consistent, steady, never large enough to alarm in isolation, never so frequent that they broke the rhythm of normal household management. They were designed to be invisible, and they had been. Wynne scrolled without speaking. The list went on. Then she opened the audio file. At first, there was just the ambient sound of a room, the soft hum of appliances, a sound like the kitchen on Elderberry Lane. Then Sylvia's voice came through clearly with the flat precision of someone who does not raise their voice because she has never needed to. We just need her out of the house first. Then Brendan lowered the hesitation in his voice, distinguishable even through the recording. I told you we need to do this carefully. Carefully. A brief pause. She is already adjusting, Brendan. We have everything in place. If we move now, we secure everything before she realizes what Calvin changed. Dorothea stopped breathing. I do not want it to look suspicious, Brendan said. It will not, Sylvia replied. Not if we control what people see. Another pause, then colder with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing logistics. We just need her out of the house first. The recording ended. The kitchen at Wynn's house was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a car passed on the street. Play it again, Dorothea said. Wynn looked at her. Then she pressed play. Dorothea listened the second time without flinching. She was listening differently now, the way you listen when you are no longer trying to disbelieve what you are hearing. She cataloged Brendan's voice, the specific texture of his uncertainty, the moments where he might have said no and did not. She cataloged Sylvia's voice, the architecture of her certainty, the way she moved through the conversation like a person executing a plan she had already reviewed many times. When the recording ended the second time, Dorothea looked at the other files still waiting in the folder. She looked at the second document, the one labeled with the word that made her jaw tighten: signatures. She recognized her own name. It was at the bottom of each page in ink in what appeared to be her handwriting. But when she leaned close to the screen, something in her chest tightened in a particular way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with certainty. 68 years of signing her name. The letter Y in Hargrove, the way she always curved the tail upward into a small loop, habit she had had since she was 15 years old, and a penmanship teacher at Jefferson Middle School had told her she had elegant descenders. The Y on these documents went straight down. The capital D at the beginning of her first name she always made with a particular outward curve at the base, an unconscious flourish Calvin had teased her about for 4 decades. On these documents, the curve was absent. That is not my signature, she said. Wynn leaned in. It looks very close. It is not mine. She said it with the calm of someone reading a fact. 68 years. You know what your own hand has made. She sat back and looked at the screen for a moment. Then she said, "What is in the video?" The video was grainy, shot from a low angle, the way a recording looks when it has been made by something placed unobtrusively on a shelf or a counter. The setting was familiar immediately. The white cabinets, the blue ceramic backsplash, her own kitchen. The timestamp in the corner showed a date 6 weeks ago. Sylvia was speaking with her back partially to the camera. Brendan was pacing. His voice was strained in the way of a man who has been having a version of the same argument for a long time. You are pushing too hard, he said. I am pushing because we are running out of time. Sylvia's voice was level. The lenders are not going to wait forever, Brendan. We have a window. She is my mother. She is. And that house is what saves us. A pause. Unless you would rather explain to Roland Vass why we do not have the money we promised him. Brendan went quiet. I already told you when, Sylvia said. Sunday, while she is at church. Dorothea reached out and closed the laptop. She sat in the chair at Wynn's kitchen table with her hands resting flat on the surface, and she looked at the closed laptop and she thought about a Sunday morning 6 weeks ago, one of the unremarkable Sundays of early September, when she had come home from church and Brendan had been in the kitchen and Sylvia had been folding laundry and everything had seemed ordinary. That was 6 weeks ago. They had already made the decision by then. They had already chosen the date. Dorothea, Wynn said carefully. I need a few minutes. Wynn nodded and got up and put the kettle on. Dorothea sat with the silence. She thought about Roland Vass, a name she had never heard before. A person whose relationship to her family she did not yet understand, but who had just appeared in a recorded conversation in her own kitchen as a financial pressure point, serious enough that Sylvia referenced him as a deadline. She thought about what Sylvia had said. The lenders, the window, the language of someone managing a transaction, not a family. She thought about the words she had understood clearly in the audio recording. What Calvin changed. That was when her phone rang. The number was one she did not recognize with a local area code. She almost did not answer. Then something made her pick up. The voice on the other end was a woman's older, with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to delivering difficult information without inflection. Dorothea Hargrove. Yes. My name is Lenora Finch. I worked with your husband's attorney for many years. Dorothea's grip on the phone tightened slightly. Why are you calling me? Because I needed to confirm that it was happening. And because you need to know one thing before you do something that would give them an advantage. What thing? Do not go back to that house tonight. Do not contact them. Do not give them any indication that you have what is in that flash drive. The precision of that sentence stopped Dorothea cold. How do you know about the flash drive? A brief pause, because I put it there. Dorothea stood up from her chair without realizing she was doing it, moving to the window of Wynn's kitchen, looking out at the backyard where the last of the October garden was fading to brown. You also left the envelope. Yes. In my sister's handwriting. Yes. The woman's voice did not change register. Calvin left me samples of her handwriting. Greeting cards, old notes. He said if you were ever in a situation where something was seriously wrong, you would try to fix it immediately. You would knock on that door and demand explanations. You would try to smooth things over. A pause. He said Irene's handwriting was the one thing that would make you stop and read before you acted. Dorothea said nothing for a long moment. He knew me, she finally said. It came out quieter than she intended. He knew you very well, Lenora Finch said. That is why he came to see Stuart Bellamy twice in the last 6 months of his life. Once with questions, once with decisions. What does that mean? It means he found something, and then he did what he could with the time he had left. Another pause, and then the question that would pull Dorothea through the next 12 hours. How much do you know about what Calvin changed in the weeks before he died? Dorothea looked across the kitchen at Wynn, who was watching her with the careful attention of a good friend reading a situation. Not enough, Dorothea said. Then you need to know all of it, Lenora Finch said. Before they move again, I will text you an address. Tomorrow morning, 10:30. The line went quiet. Dorothea lowered the phone and stood at the window for a moment longer. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post at the back of Wynn's yard, looked around with its small, sharp intelligence, and flew away. The afternoon light was thinning into the gray particular to Ohio in October, the kind of gray that does not feel like absence but like preparation. She had been locked out of her own house that morning by her own son. She had discovered that money had been moving out of her accounts for more than a year. She had heard her son and his wife discussing the timing of her removal from her home as if it were a real estate transaction. She had been told by a woman she had never spoken to before that her husband had spent the last months of his dying life trying to protect her from exactly this. And underneath all of that, beneath the shock and the grief and the cold clarity that was beginning to replace both of them, was a question she could not yet answer. What had Calvin changed? She turned back to Wynn. I need to stay here tonight, she said. Wynn was already moving toward the hall closet where she kept the extra blankets. I already knew that, she said. Dorothea sat back down at the table. She put the flash drive in her purse next to the envelope with Irene's handwriting. She placed her hand flat on the table the way she did when she was teaching, when she needed a class of 8-year-olds to feel that the person at the front of the room was certain of something, that there was ground beneath the uncertainty. Calvin had prepared for this. He'd been dying and he had spent his diminishing energy not on despair, but on preparation. He had gone to a lawyer twice. He had collected samples of her sister's handwriting. He had placed a flash drive in a car and arranged for a woman named Lenora Finch to deploy it at the right moment. He had believed Dorothea could handle what came next. He had built the tools and left them where she could find them. The least she could do was pick them up. She did not sleep. Wynne had made up the guest room with the kind of quiet efficiency that long friendship produces: fresh sheets and a lamp left on low, and a glass of water on the nightstand. And Dorothea had lain down on top of the covers, still dressed, staring at the ceiling, while the house around her settled into the ordinary sounds of someone else's home. Pipes, wind against windows, a dog somewhere down the street announcing itself to the night. Her mind would not slow down, and she had stopped asking it to. By 4 in the morning, she had given up the pretense of rest and was sitting in the chair by the window, watching the sky above Wynne's backyard move from black to the particular dark blue that precedes dawn in the Midwest. She was thinking about a conversation she had with Calvin in the spring of the year he died, one of those conversations that had seemed minor at the time and now felt like it had been trying to tell her something she had not known how to hear. They'd been sitting on the back patio, and he had said out of an apparent silence that he wanted her to promise him something. She had said, of course, the way you say of course to someone you have been married to for 4 decades. He had said he wanted her to promise that if anything ever felt wrong after he was gone, she would trust that feeling. Not explain it away, not smooth it over for the sake of keeping peace. Trust it. She had promised. Then she had brought him another glass of iced tea, and they had talked about the garden, and she had filed the moment away in the category of things dying men say because they need to say them. She understood now that he had not been reaching for comfort. He had already found something. He had been trying to hand it to her in the only way available to him at that moment, and she had accepted the gesture without understanding what it contained. The text from Lenora Finch arrived at 7:40 in the morning. Davenport Diner, 10:30 a.m. The address was on the east side of Columbus, a neighborhood of small businesses and old brick buildings that had survived 3 cycles of urban reinvention by being too solid to tear down cheaply. Wynne drove her there. Wynne had made the offer at breakfast without discussing it, setting a plate of toast in front of Dorothea and saying she would follow in her own car and wait in the parking lot. And Dorothea had started to object and then had not, because the part of her that was still thinking clearly recognized that wanting to handle this alone was a form of pride she could not currently afford. Before they left, Wynne saved the files from the flash drive to her personal laptop. Dorothea watched her do it and said nothing but filed it away as the practical move it was. Whatever was on that drive needed to exist in more than one place. The diner was exactly what the neighborhood suggested it would be. A faded sign, booths with red vinyl seats gone soft at the edges. The smell of coffee and something frying the particular atmosphere of a place where people have been having difficult conversations for 50 years because the coffee is reliably strong and the staff reliably disinterested. Lenora Finch was in the back booth. Dorothea had constructed an image of her during the drive over, and the real woman both matched and exceeded it. 71 years old, she estimated, with white hair cut short and neat, and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead above gray eyes that assessed Dorothea's approach with the kind of direct attention that belonged to someone who had spent decades sitting across tables from people in distress and had long since stopped performing sympathy she did not feel. She was wearing a blue check shirt, and she had a manila folder on the table in front of her, and she was not fidgeting with it. Her hands were still, Dorothea sat down across from her without being invited to. She put her purse on the seat beside her and she placed the original envelope, the one with Irene's handwriting, on the table between them. "You manipulated me," Dorothea said. Lenora Finch looked at the envelope. Then she looked at Dorothea. "Yes. You used my dead sister's handwriting to control my behavior in a moment of crisis. I used it to stop you from walking into a situation you did not yet have the tools to handle." Lenora's voice was even, not defensive. "There is a difference, but I understand if it does not feel like one right now." "It does not. Calvin told me you would say exactly that." Something shifted very slightly in Lenora's expression, not quite a smile, not quite grief. "He also told me that your being angry at me meant the note had worked, that you had stopped and read instead of knocked." Dorothea sat with that for a moment. The logic of it was irritating precisely because it was sound. She had stopped. She had read. She had not knocked on that door and given Brendan and Sylvia the 48 hours they would have needed to complete whatever was already in motion. "Tell me about Calvin," she said. Lenora opened the folder. Calvin Hargrove had first come to see Stuart Bellamy, his attorney of 19 years, in early April. He came alone without telling Dorothea, which Lenora acknowledged was a decision Calvin had wrestled with. He came because of a single line item in a bank statement, a transfer of $3,200 from the joint household account on a day he was in the hospital for a second round of chemotherapy. Dorothea had been in that hospital with him. Brendan had been given temporary access to the account specifically to handle utilities and household bills, while both of his parents were otherwise occupied. The transfer was small enough to have a reasonable explanation. Calvin had asked Brendan about it indirectly, the way careful men ask questions when they are not yet ready to make accusations, and Brendan had deflected with the ease of someone who had prepared for the question. That deflection, Calvin had told Bellamy, was what convinced him something was actually wrong. An innocent man gives details. A guilty man changes the subject smoothly. Over the following 3 months, Lenora had tracked the account activity at Calvin's request. 7 more transfers, each one timed to a period when Dorothea was distracted or exhausted, each one carrying a plausible description, each one small enough to pass without alarm. "He found the pattern," Dorothea said. "He found the first evidence of the pattern," Lenora said. "He came back to Bellamy in June. That second meeting was different. The first time he came with questions. The second time he came with decisions." Dorothea looked at the folder. "What did he decide?" "He updated everything. The trust, the deed, every financial instrument connected to the house and the accounts. He made you the sole controlling authority with no provision for delegation, without your notarized consent and physical presence." Lenora slid a document across the table. "Nothing they have shown anyone, nothing they may have had you sign supersedes this. It was executed properly, witnessed, filed. Your house is yours. It has been yours this entire time." Dorothea picked up the document. She read it carefully, the way Calvin would have wanted her to read it, taking her time with the language, because language mattered, and he had understood that. When she set it down, something in her chest had loosened slightly, but she did not mistake that loosening for safety. She had heard Sylvia's voice on that recording. Sylvia had known about this. Sylvia had said in Dorothea's own kitchen that they needed to move before Dorothea realized what Calvin had changed, which meant Sylvia also knew there was a legal barrier, and she had been trying to work around it anyway. That was a different category of person than Dorothea had allowed herself to consider when thinking about her daughter-in-law. "There is more," Lenora said, and reached into the folder again. She produced a second envelope. Older than the first, the edges of the paper softened slightly with time. Dorothea's name on the front in handwriting she recognized immediately because it was nothing like Irene's measured loops, and everything like the man she had been married to for 41 years. Calvin wrote with more pressure on the downstrokes, a slight rightward lean letters that looked like they meant what they said. He asked me to give this to you when you were ready to hear the truth without trying to protect anyone from it, Lenora said. Dorothea did not ask how Lenora would know when that moment had arrived. She understood sitting in that booth with the envelope in her hands and the documentation of her husband's final protective acts spread on the table in front of her, that this was the moment. She had been locked out of her own home. She had heard her son agree to a plan that treated her as an obstacle. She had seen the spreadsheet of what had been taken. She was ready. She opened the envelope and read. Calvin's letter was 2 pages written in his deliberate hand. He told her he was sorry he had not said any of this while he still could. He told her he had needed to be wrong, had wanted to be wrong, had held on to the hope that the pattern Lenora was documenting would turn out to have an innocent explanation. He told her about the afternoon in March when he had confronted Brendan not directly, not with accusations, but with enough of the truth that an innocent man would have sat down and said, "Let me show you what actually happened." Brendan had done the opposite. He had looked Calvin in the eye and denied everything smoothly, confidently, the way you deny something when you have rehearsed the denial. That was the moment Calvin had stopped hoping he was wrong. He wrote about the trust and the deed, what he had done, and why the specific language he had insisted on with Bellamy. He wrote about Lenora and the flash drive and the reason he had chosen Irene's handwriting, because he knew Dorothea, because he had loved her long enough to know exactly what she would do in a crisis and exactly what she needed in order to do the right thing instead. And then near the bottom of the second page, he wrote the sentence that Dorothea would carry for the rest of her life. Love does not mean surrender. You gave your whole life to this family. That does not mean you owe them your silence. Protect yourself, Dorothea, even if it means seeing the truth about someone you love. She set the letter down on the table. Outside the diner window, a delivery truck was pulling away from the curb, the ordinary commerce of a Monday morning in Columbus, proceeding without reference to anything happening inside this booth. She looked at Lenora Finch, who had not spoken while she read and did not speak now. He was dying, Dorothea said, and he spent his time doing this. He spent a portion of it doing this, Lenora said carefully. He also spent a great deal of it being your husband. Dorothea looked back at the letter. She thought about Calvin sitting in Stuart Bellamy's office in June, months before he died, going through documents, making decisions, building something she could use after he was gone. She thought about how much energy that would have required and how little energy he had had to spare. There is a safe deposit box, Lenora said. First State Bank downtown branch. He put your name as the sole authorized party. What is in it? The original deed, the original trust documents, and a ledger he kept himself. Lenora paused. Every transfer Brendan made going back to February of last year. Dates, amounts, Calvin's notes beside each entry. 14 months of documentation in Calvin's own hand. Dorothea absorbed that. February of last year. That was 11 months before Calvin died. Brendan had been moving money while his father was still alive, still in the house on Elderberry Lane, still sitting in his chair by the window in the evenings. The money had not started moving because Calvin was gone and Dorothea was vulnerable, and circumstances had created an opportunity. The money had been moving while Calvin was in the next room. That changed the shape of everything. He knew, Dorothea said, not for the first time. But this time the knowing had different weight. She was still sitting with that weight when her phone rang. It was Wynne calling from the parking lot. She answered, and Wynn's voice was measured in the way that meant she had found something out and was managing her own reaction to it before delivering the information. A friend of Wynn's who worked at the Franklin County Courthouse had called that morning. There was a civil filing on record 3 months old, a claim against Brendan Hargrove for $340,000. The plaintiff was a man named Roland Vass, the principal of a small commercial real estate investment firm based in Columbus. The claim involved a failed mixed-use development deal, a project that had collapsed in the rising interest rate environment of 2023, leaving a significant number of investors holding losses. The filing indicated that Brendan had been one of the managing partners and that Vass held him personally liable for a portion of the shortfall. The court-ordered deadline for resolution was December 31st, 11 weeks away. Dorothea listened to all of this without speaking. When Wynne finished, there was a brief silence, and then Dorothea said, "Thank you," and ended the call. She looked at Lenora across the table. "Do you know the name Roland Vass?" Lenora's expression confirmed that she did. "Brendan has a debt of $340,000 due at the end of the year," Dorothea said. "The house on Elderberry Lane with no mortgage is worth roughly $480,000. If they could establish control of it and move quickly, they could sell it or leverage it before you understood what was happening," Lenora said. "Yes." Dorothea sat back. She was doing the arithmetic not of money but of motivation, and the numbers were coming out clearly. Brendan was not simply greedy. Brendan was drowning. His business had failed. A man named Roland Vass was taking him to court. The deadline was 11 weeks away, and he had a wife who was willing and able to construct a plan, and a mother who had spent 30 years being the kind of person who trusted first and questioned later. She thought about what she would have done if Brendan had come to her and simply asked for help. She would have sat down with him, and they would have looked at the numbers together, and she would have done what mothers do. He had known that. That was why he had not asked. Asking would have meant honesty, and honesty would have meant Dorothea understanding the situation, and understanding the situation would have meant Dorothea having a voice in the solution. Sylvia, Dorothea suspected, had determined very early that a situation in which Dorothea had a voice was a situation that could not be controlled. She folded Calvin's letter and put it back in its envelope and placed it carefully in her purse alongside the other envelope with Irene's handwriting. 2 letters, 2 forms of protection from 2 people who had loved her and were no longer here to extend that protection in person. "I need a lawyer," Dorothea said. "I know one," Lenora said. She was already gathering the folder. Adrian Kowalski's office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building on North High Street, and she was, Dorothea would later think, exactly the kind of lawyer you needed for exactly this kind of problem. 52 years old, with the economy of movement that belongs to people who have learned not to waste energy on things that do not matter. She cleared a meeting to see them that afternoon and listened to the full account without interrupting, making occasional notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting too small to read from across the table. When Dorothea finished, Adrienne set down her pen and looked at the documents Lenore had provided and at the screenshots Wynne had printed that morning at the office supply store down the street from her house. She did not comment on the signature discrepancy at length because she had already sent the documents to a forensic handwriting examiner. That was the first call she had made. "Your house is legally yours," Adrienne said. "Completely. The trust Calvin executed is valid and was filed properly before his death. Nothing they have presented to any bank or institution changes that." "They filed a loan application," Dorothea said, "using the property as collateral." Adrienne nodded. "2 days before this past Sunday, I have already started the process to freeze any financial activity tied to the property. No loan can be approved, no transfer can be executed, nothing can be listed or leveraged." She looked at Dorothea directly. "They will know something has changed when that freeze hits. And then they will contact me. Yes, and when they do, you do not meet with them alone. You do not agree to anything verbally, and you do not let the conversation become a negotiation. Adrian paused. You let them talk. What they say will tell you where they are planning to go next. Dorothea nodded. She was absorbing the strangeness of sitting in a lawyer's office planning a legal response to her own son's actions. She was managing that strangeness the way she had managed a great many difficult things in her life, by keeping her attention on what needed to be done rather than on the size of the feeling underneath it. There is one more thing I need, Adrian said. We need everything on that flash drive documented through proper channels, and we need corroborating sources wherever possible. Anyone who can speak to a pattern of behavior, anyone who witnessed conversations, any written communication. She looked at Lenora. The safe deposit box. I can arrange access today, Lenora said. Good. Once we have the original documents in Calvin's ledger, our position is significantly stronger. Dorothea left Adriana's office with Lenora and Wynne at 4 in the afternoon, stepping out onto North High Street into a day that had turned cold and overcast. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment while Lenora and Wynne spoke quietly near the building entrance. Her phone buzzed, a number she did not recognize but a Columbus area code. She answered, Mrs. Hargrove. A man's voice, middle-aged, businesslike in the manner of someone who spends a great deal of time on the phone. My name is Frederick Caulfield. I think we need to talk. The name took Dorothea a moment, then it placed itself. Brendan's older half-brother, Dorothea's son from her first brief marriage before Calvin. Frederick was 45, an engineer in Cincinnati, a man Dorothea had seen perhaps a dozen times at family occasions over the past 2 decades. A man who existed at the comfortable edge of the family rather than its center. He had sent flowers when Calvin died and called once in the months afterward, and that had been the extent of their contact. How did you find me? Dorothea asked. When Osgood called me this morning. She thought I should know what was happening. A pause. She was right. What do you know about what is happening? More than I should have stayed quiet about, Frederick said, and his voice carried the particular flatness of a man delivering a verdict on his own behavior. Brendan came to see me in September. He had a document he wanted me to sign. He said it was about simplifying the family estate arrangements, making things easier for everyone going forward. A pause. He specifically mentioned the property on Elderberry Lane. Dorothea closed her eyes briefly. Elderberry Lane. Brendan had named the house to Frederick in September, 6 weeks before he changed the locks. You did not sign it, she said. No, it felt wrong. I told him I needed to think about it, and then I never called him back. Another pause longer. I should have called you. I knew something about it was off, and I told myself I was probably misreading the situation. I told myself it was not my business. His voice went quieter. That was wrong. Yes, Dorothea said. It was. He did not argue with her. That was, she thought, at least something. I kept the email he sent me beforehand, Frederick said, and the document itself. I can bring them to you tonight if you want. Come to Wynn's house, Dorothea said, and gave him the address. He arrived at 6:30, tall and somewhat worn around the edges in the way of a man carrying more than his fair share of various responsibilities. He sat at Wynn's kitchen table and placed 2 things in front of Dorothea, a printed email chain and a document of several pages. The email was from Brendan's personal account sent 3 weeks before he had driven to Cincinnati to deliver the actual paperwork. The language was careful and mild and entirely strategic, the phrasing of someone who had thought hard about how to make a request sound like a natural extension of family concern. Dorothea read it twice. Then she looked at Frederick, who was watching her with the expression of a man waiting for a judgment he believed he deserved. He sent the same kind of email to Nora, she said. Frederick nodded slowly. He had not known that, but he was not surprised. Dorothea placed the two items on the table, side by side with the financial documents from the flash drive and the screenshots Adrian's office had printed. She looked at the full arrangement, the transfer records going back 14 months, the emails to Frederick in September, the email to Nora, the application for the home equity loan filed 2 days before Sunday, the recording from her kitchen dated 6 weeks ago, the video with Sylvia's voice stating a specific date and a specific plan. The picture they made together was not a picture of a family in financial crisis making desperate decisions. It was a picture of an architecture, a structure built over time with different pieces placed in different positions to serve a unified purpose. Brendan had been the visible face of it. Sylvia had been the engineer, and the purpose had been from the beginning to separate Dorothea Hargrove from the asset her husband had spent 35 years creating. She planned this from a long way back, Wynne said quietly from her chair across the table. She planned it before Calvin died, Dorothea said. The first transfer was in February. He was still alive in February. She looked at Frederick. Brendan was moving money while Calvin was still in that house. Frederick looked at the table. I did not know that. Brendan did not tell anyone what he needed telling. He found a different way. She paused. He found Sylvia. She said it without venom. It was not a deflection of Brendan's responsibility. It was an observation about what kind of person her son had become, or perhaps always been without her fully seeing it. A man who had looked at a problem and chosen the solution that required the least honesty and the most maneuvering. Her phone rang again. This time she recognized the number. Brendan! She looked at the screen for a moment. Nora sitting beside her tensed slightly. Wynne folded her hands on the table. Frederick said nothing. Dorothea picked up the phone. Mom. His voice was familiar in a way that still managed to cause her some small interior movement that she did not try to stop or explain. Brendan, I have been trying to reach you. A pause. I think there are things you do not understand about the situation. Tell me about March 15th, she said. Silence. Your father spoke to you on March 15th, Dorothea said. He asked you some questions. You looked him in the eye and told him he was wrong. The silence on Brendan's end was the kind that has texture. It was not the silence of a man collecting his thoughts. It was the silence of a man who had not expected the conversation to begin at this particular coordinate. He wrote it down, Dorothea said. He wrote down the date and what you said and what he understood about what that meant. He was a careful man. You knew that. You should have known he was keeping a record. Mom. His voice had changed, the practiced steadiness of it wearing thin at the edges. If you would just let me explain. I want to ask you one question, Dorothea said. When you changed that lock, what did you think I would do? A long pause. Then in a voice that was quieter than anything else he had said, Brendan answered. I thought you would accept it, like you always have. The words went through her cleanly. She felt them the way you feel a diagnosis, something that changes what you know about your own history by reframing everything you thought was fine. That is where you were wrong, she said and ended the call. She placed the phone on the table. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the October night had settled fully over Wynne's backyard, and the window above the sink showed only darkness and the dim reflection of the kitchen light. Wynne reached across the table and covered Dorothea's hand with her own for a moment. Then she withdrew it because Dorothea did not need comfort right now. Dorothea needed clarity, and she had it, and everyone at the table knew it. Dorothea looked at the documents spread before her, at the evidence they had assembled in less than 36 hours, at the shape of what had been done to her and what still needed to be done about it. Tomorrow, she said, we go to Adrian's office with all of this. What about the safe deposit box? Lenora asked. First thing in the morning. Dorothea gathered the papers into a careful stack. I want to see what Calvin left us before we sit down with the lawyers. She said it that way deliberately. What Calvin left us, because that was what it was. Not evidence of betrayal, though it was that too. While the painful excavation of a son's corruption, it was also, at its core, the last act of a man who had spent 35 years building something worth protecting and had used his final months ensuring that what he built would survive him. She thought about the safe deposit box at First State Bank, the original deed, the original trust documents, and the ledger Calvin's careful handwriting, 14 months of documentation that neither Brendan nor Sylvia knew existed. They thought they had controlled the information. They thought they had managed the narrative, prepared. The neighbors filed the paperwork, chosen the date, changed the lock, and placed the outcome beyond Dorothea's ability to reverse. They had not accounted for the fact that the man who built the house on Elderberry Lane was also the kind of man who, while dying, had kept a record. Tomorrow, Dorothea was going to open a box that her husband had prepared for exactly this moment. She already knew, in the way you know things that have not yet happened but feel inevitable, that what was inside it was going to change the final shape of everything. First State Bank sat on the corner of Broad and 4th Street in downtown Columbus, a building that had occupied that corner since 1923. Dorothea had been inside it perhaps a dozen times over the years. Calvin had preferred this branch because the manager in the 1990s had given them a fair rate on their first home equity line without condescension. And Calvin remembered gestures like that. He remained loyal to institutions that treated him with respect. She thought about that as she walked through the doors Tuesday morning, with Lenora beside her and Nora one step behind. Nora had arrived the night before on the last flight from Portland, appearing at Wynn's door at 11:15 with a carry-on bag and the expression of a woman who had spent 4 hours on an airplane converting shock into resolve. She was 34, and she had her father's directness and her mother's capacity for stillness, and she had held Dorothea for a long moment in Wynn's entryway without saying anything, which was exactly right. When she finally spoke, the first thing she said was not about Brendan or the house or the documents. She said, "You look like yourself, Mom. That matters." Dorothea had not expected that to be the thing that made her eyes sting. The safe deposit box was in a room at the back of the bank, behind a door that required 2 keys turned simultaneously. The attendant left them alone with it as protocol required, and Dorothea sat down at the small table and opened the box with the same deliberate care she had been applying to everything since Sunday morning. Inside were 3 items. The first 2 were what Lenore had described: the original deed to 14 Elderberry Lane and the updated trust amendment bearing Calvin's signature, and the notary's seal and the language Dorothea had already reviewed at Adrian's office. Sole controlling authority, no provision for delegation. The third item was a composition notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover. Calvin had used this kind of notebook his entire adult life for notes and calculations in the various records he kept of the house's maintenance history. Dorothea recognized it before she opened it. She opened it. The first entry was dated February 9th of the previous year, a Tuesday. Dorothea searched her memory for that date and found that Calvin had been home that day because his oncologist had moved his appointment and Dorothea had gone to the grocery store alone in the morning. He had been in the house. He had been in the house, and he had been writing this. The entries were exactly what Lenora had described: dates, amounts, the account they had come from, a brief description matching whatever explanation had been offered at the time, and beside each entry in smaller handwriting, Calvin's assessment, sometimes a single word, sometimes a phrase. March through May, he wrote things like unclear and needs verification. By summer, the notes changed. By August, he was writing intentional beside each entry with the flat certainty of a man who had stopped hoping he was wrong. The final entry was dated 3 weeks before Calvin died. The amount was $1,200. The description Brendan had provided was household maintenance reserve. Calvin's note beside it was 4 words: "He will not stop." Dorothea closed the notebook. Nora had been reading over her shoulder, and she straightened up slowly and looked at the wall for a moment. Lenora sat quietly across the table. None of them spoke for a while. Then Dorothea put the notebook and the documents back in the box and said to the attendant when he returned that she would need certified copies of the deed and the trust amendment for her attorney. She did not cry in the bank. She had work to do, and the work required that she remain functional. She filed the grief the way she filed other things that required her attention, but could not receive it yet. There would be time for it later, and she would give it the time it deserved. Calvin had written, "He will not stop," in a composition notebook 3 weeks before he died. He had prepared everything he could prepare, and then he had died anyway, and Brendan had done exactly what Calvin feared he would do, and now Dorothea was sitting in a bank downtown with the proof of it in her hands. And the question was not whether she had enough to act. The question was how. Adrienne Kowalski answered that question in her office 2 hours later. She reviewed the notebook entry by entry, comparing the dates against the transfer records from the flash drive, which matched with the precision of 2 records kept by 2 different people, documenting the same events from opposite sides. She reviewed the deed and the trust amendment. She set Roland Vass's civil filing beside the home equity loan application and showed Dorothea and Nora how the timeline connected, how the pressure from Vass's December deadline explained the acceleration of everything that had happened in the past several months. Then she told Dorothea what was going to happen next. "I have already received a response from their attorney," Adrienne said. "Timothy Egan, whose office is over in Worthington. He is competent, but he has been given an incomplete picture of what his clients have done. That will become apparent very quickly." She looked at Dorothea steadily. "I have scheduled a meeting for Thursday at 10. Both parties, both attorneys. I want you there." "I will be there," Dorothea said. "Bring Nora." Nora, sitting beside her mother, nodded once. "One more thing," Adrienne said. She paused in the way of a lawyer who has information and is considering how to frame it. "In the course of preparing the freeze motion, one of my paralegals found something. Sylvia made inquiries approximately 6 weeks ago to a private medical consulting firm that specializes in cognitive capacity evaluations for older adults." Dorothea went very still. "No appointment was ever made," Adrienne continued. "No evaluation was ever ordered. But the inquiry was documented, and we have it. She was investigating the process for having someone declared legally incapacitated." Nora's jaw tightened visibly. Dorothea thought about that for a moment. She thought about the words Sylvia had used in the recording, the language of adjustment and confusion and stepping in to help. She understood now that those words had not been careless or improvised. They had been the first layer of a contingency plan. If the documents and the loan and the lock change had not been sufficient, there was a next step prepared. A step that would have required Dorothea to defend not just her property but her own mind. "Good," Dorothea said with a calm that surprised even her. "That belongs in the file." Adrienne nodded and made a note. They were ready. The conference room in Adrienne's building on Thursday morning had a long table and windows that looked east toward the city. Dorothea arrived 20 minutes early with Nora and Wynne and Lenora. Adrienne was already there, her materials arranged with the ordered precision that Dorothea had come to recognize as the outward expression of thorough preparation. Brendan and Sylvia arrived at 5 minutes to 10 with Timothy Egan, a heavy-set man in his 50s, carrying a briefcase that he set on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone buying time. Brendan looked tired in a way that went past the physical, the kind of tired that accumulates when a person has been managing a situation they cannot fully control for a very long time. Sylvia looked as she almost always looked, composed. Her eyes moved across the room and cataloged everything, including Frederick Caulfield, who was sitting at the far end of the table and whose presence she had not expected. She looked at Frederick for a fraction of a second longer than she looked at anyone else. Then she looked at Dorothea, and something in the arrangement of her expression shifted almost imperceptibly in the direction of recalculation. Timothy Egan opened the meeting with the mild procedural language of a lawyer trying to establish neutral ground. He spoke about family disagreements and the complexity of estate management and the good intentions of all parties. Adrian let him finish. Then she placed the first document on the table. The trust amendment, the deed, the language of sole controlling authority, the notary's seal, the filing date. She walked Egan through it with the unhurried patience of someone who has all the time in the world because the facts are on her side. Egan studied the document. He whispered something to Brendan. Brendan looked at the table. Sylvia said, "We have a documentation indicating Dorothea agreed to certain arrangements." Adrian placed the forensic handwriting examiner's preliminary report on the table. 3 pages of technical analysis concluding that the signatures on Sylvia's documents were inconsistent with verified samples expressed in the unambiguous language of professional certainty. Egan studied this too. His expression had changed. "The loan application," Adrian said, and placed that document in front of Egan. "Filed using a property your clients do not legally control 2 days before they changed the locks and removed Mrs. Hargrove from her home. The freeze motion has already been granted." Adrian placed the screenshot of Sylvia's text message to Midge Stanton on the table. Then she placed the inquiry record from the medical consulting firm. Then she looked toward the door and said, "Mr. Vass, please come in." Roland Vass entered the conference room. He was 58 with the bearing of a man who had spent 3 decades in commercial real estate and had stopped being impressed by conference rooms approximately 25 years ago. He was not there to gloat. He was there because Adrian had contacted him 2 days earlier and explained concisely that his testimony regarding the arrangement Brendan had proposed, specifically the arrangement in which Calvin and Dorothea's property had been referenced as informal collateral, without Dorothea's knowledge or consent, would be relevant to a civil proceeding. Vass had agreed to appear because he was above all a practical man, and a practical man does not pass up the opportunity to establish his own position, that of the deceived party, rather than a co-conspirator. Timothy Egan had not been told Roland Vass would be present. He looked at his client with the expression of a lawyer who has just understood the full dimensions of the problem he has been hired to manage. Vass sat down, stated his name for the record, and confirmed in 3 sentences what the documents already suggested. Brendan had represented in writing that he had authority to pledge a residential property at 14 Elderberry Lane as informal security for a portion of the business debt. Brendan had not disclosed that the property belonged solely to his mother and that he had no legal standing to make such a representation. Egan set down his pen. Sylvia began to speak. "Brendan acted under considerable financial pressure, and Mr. Vass is well aware that the circumstances of their arrangement." Brendan cut her off. "Stop." The word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the weight of something that had been held in check for a long time. He did not raise his voice. He simply stopped looking at the table and started looking at Sylvia, and the look on his face was not anger. It was exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a version of himself he does not fully recognize and has finally run out of the energy required to keep carrying it. "Stop using me as the explanation," he said. Sylvia turned to him, a warning in her expression. "I agreed to the plan," Brendan said, addressing the room now. Rather than just her, his voice stripped of every layer of practiced calm. I knew what we were doing, but this, and he gestured toward the document about the medical consulting firm. I told you I would not do that. I told you that was where I stopped. Sylvia said his name, one syllable, a door closing. She is my mother, Brendan said. He said it the way a man says something he has needed to say for a long time and has finally stopped finding reasons to defer. The room was very quiet. Roland Vass looked at the window. Timothy Egan looked at his legal pad. Adrian kept her eyes on Sylvia, who had gone very still, in a way that was different from her usual composure. This was not the stillness of someone in control. This was the stillness of someone recalculating in real time. Adrienne closed the folder in front of her. We will proceed with formal filings, she said. Given the documentation, I expect this to resolve without extended litigation, but that will depend on your client's cooperation. She looked at Egan. I will be in touch. Egan nodded. He was already calculating. They all stood, and the room rearranged itself into the awkward geometry of a formal proceeding that has reached its conclusion. Vass left first without speaking to anyone. Egan guided Sylvia toward the door with a hand at her elbow, speaking quietly. Brendan did not move with them. Dorothea walked toward the door. She was almost through it when Brendan said her name. She stopped. She did not turn immediately. She felt in those 2 or 3 seconds the full weight of who he was to her, the boy she had raised, the person she had believed she knew, the man who had looked his dying father in the eye and denied everything, who had built a structure of quiet deception over more than a year, and who had just in front of lawyers and witnesses and his own wife said, she is my mother, with the voice of someone remembering something they had let themselves forget. She turned. He looked the way people look when they have been hollowed out by what they have done and are only now, in the aftermath of consequences, beginning to feel the full dimensions of the space they have created. I am sorry, he said. 2 words, plain and without decoration. Dorothea looked at him for a long moment. I know you are, she said. That does not tell me yet what you are sorry for, whether it is what you did or that you got caught or that you lost. I do not know which of those it is, and I am not sure you do either. She paused. But I want you to think about one thing. He waited. You did not come to me, she said. When you were drowning, you did not come to me. You decided what I would say, and you decided what I would do, and you made choices based on the version of me you had already decided on. You did not give me the chance to be your mother. She felt the weight of it as she said it, not as accusation, but as the plainest fact available. That is what I will be sitting with for a long time. Brendan said nothing. His eyes were wet. Dorothea turned and walked out of the conference room and into the hallway where Nora was waiting. Nora looked at her mother's face and asked no questions. She simply fell into step beside her, and they walked down the hallway together toward the elevator and the street below. 3 days later, Dorothea went home. She drove herself. She had asked the others gently but clearly to come separately and arrive after her, and they had understood without requiring explanation. This first moment belonged to her alone. Elderberry Lane on a Friday afternoon in late October had the particular quiet of a residential street after the school buses have run and before the evening commute returns people to their driveways. Leaves had collected along the curb. A neighbor's basketball hoop cast a long shadow across the pavement. Dorothea pulled into her own driveway and sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, looking at the house. The porch was clear. The flag Calvin had mounted in 2003 moved in a light wind. The flower beds still needed tending, the same as they had the Sunday she left. She got out of the car. Marguerite Stanton was standing at the edge of the driveway. Midge had the quality of the genuinely contrite, which is that they do not announce themselves, they simply appear and wait. She was holding a small box which she held out when Dorothea came toward her. "Calvin gave me something to keep," Midge said. "2 years ago. He said if there was ever a day when you needed to be reminded that you belonged here, I should give you this." Dorothea opened the box. Inside was a house key on a plain ring, worn and slightly discolored from years of handling. She recognized it. It was the spare Calvin had always kept on the hook inside the kitchen cabinet, the one he had had made in 1994, when the locksmith told him every household should have a documented backup. He had given it to Midge 2 years ago. 2 years ago when he was already sick, already worried, already beginning to understand that the time remaining to him was finite and that he needed to use it well. "He thought of everything," Dorothea said, not to Midge specifically. "He thought of you," Midge said. That was mostly what he thought of. Dorothea closed her hand around the old key. Midge had more to say. She could see it, and she waited. "I believed Brendan," Midge said. "He was convincing, and I did not ask the questions I should have asked. I have been your neighbor for 23 years, and I let a half-hour conversation in September undo all of that." She looked at Dorothea with the directness of a woman who has decided that euphemism is no longer available to her. "I am ashamed of that." "You were not the only one he convinced," Dorothea said. "He has had practice." She met Midge's eyes. "But thank you for telling me. Last Monday that mattered." Midge nodded once, and something in her posture settled, and she walked back across the street to her own house. Dorothea watched her go. Then she turned to face the front door of 14 Elderberry Lane. She took the new key from her purse. She had chosen this locksmith herself, had watched him install. The hardware had held the two finished keys in her hand and pocketed both of them before he left. She placed the key in the lock and turned it, and the bolt moved with the clean mechanical certainty of something well made and properly fitted. She pushed the door open. The smell of the house reached her before anything else. Something that belonged specifically to this combination of rooms, this particular collection of wood and fabric, and the accumulated presence of the years lived here. A smell that had no name because it did not need one. It was the smell of home, and it was exactly as she remembered it, and that fact alone steadied something in her that had been uncertain since Sunday morning. She went inside. She moved through the rooms without hurrying. The kitchen, where she opened the cabinet above the refrigerator and found her own things exactly where she kept them. The hallway, where the framed photographs she had hung in 1999 were still in their places, though she could see that several of them had been moved slightly and replaced at angles that were almost right but not quite. She straightened them one by one as she passed. She went into the living room last. Calvin's chair was there. By the window on the east wall, turned slightly toward the room the way he had always preferred it, so he could see both the yard outside and the doorway into the hall. The armrest smooth from decades of contact. The particular give of the cushion, shaped to the weight it had held for 30 years. Dorothea crossed the room and stood beside it. She placed her hand on the back of the chair, her palm flat against the fabric, and she stood there quietly for a moment that had no specific duration that existed outside the ordinary movement of time. She did not speak. She did not need to. The things she felt in that moment were not the kind that required translation into language. They were the kind that simply are the grief and the gratitude existing together in the same space without contradicting each other, the way they do when you have loved someone long enough that you cannot separate your loss of them from your gratitude for having had them. She heard the front door open behind her, Nora and Wynne and Lenore arriving as she had asked after her. She did not turn around immediately. She listened to the sound of people she trusted moving through the rooms of her house. She heard Nora's voice from the kitchen, practical and warm, asking where Dorothea kept the coffee. She heard Wynne's footsteps in the hallway unhurried. She heard Lenora set something down on the dining room table, some document that would need attention, because there were still things to attend to, and they would attend to them. Dorothea took her hand from the back of Calvin's chair. She went to the hall closet and found the wooden box on the shelf where she had kept it for years, the one that held the photographs and letters and small preserved things that did not belong anywhere in particular, but needed a place. She opened it. She placed Calvin's letter inside in its envelope, alongside the envelope, with Irene's handwriting. She held them both for a moment, these two forms of protection from two people who had loved her and found ways to extend that love past the boundaries of their own time. Then she closed the box and put it back on the shelf. She went to the front door. She stood on the porch in the late afternoon light of an October day in Columbus, Ohio, with the smell of fallen leaves in the air and the sound of her daughter moving comfortably through the rooms behind her, and she looked at the welcome mat. She bent down and lifted it. Nothing underneath, just the plain wood of the porch, slightly weathered, solid. She let the mat fall back into place and straightened up. There was a specific quality to the relief of finding nothing there. It was not the relief of absence, the absence of threat or danger or the hidden thing that changes everything. It was the relief of completeness. She had begun all of this by lifting a mat and finding something that sent her life sideways. She was ending it by lifting the same mat and finding what belonged there, which was nothing at all, which was ordinary life, the kind that does not require warning notes and hidden drawers, and the careful preparations of a man who loved her enough to protect her from beyond his own death. She looked at the new lock. She looked at the key in her hand. She put the key into the lock and turned it, and then she took it out and turned it again, and she did this a third time, not from uncertainty, but because she was establishing something, reminding her own hands of something they needed to know. This lock opened for her. This door was hers to close. She went inside and closed it behind her. Nora appeared in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee, and Dorothea took one of them, and they went into the living room together and sat down. Not in Calvin's chair, on the sofa across from it where Dorothea could see it properly. "Adrian called while I was in the kitchen," Nora said. "Egan's office reached out. Brendan is prepared to cooperate fully with the documentation review and the account reconciliation. Sylvia's attorney has asked for a separate meeting." "Sylvia's attorney," Dorothea said. "She retained someone independently. This morning." Nora looked at her mother over the rim of her cup. "I think the meeting in that conference room went differently than she expected." Dorothea thought about Brendan's voice when he had said, "She is my mother." She thought about the look on Sylvia's face in the instant before she controlled it, the look of a person whose collaborator had just stepped off the board. "Let Adrian handle it," Dorothea said. Nora nodded. "That is what I told her." They sat in a comfortable quiet for a while, the kind that does not need to be filled. Outside, the light was going gold as the afternoon moved toward evening, the particular gold of October in the Midwest that knows the year is ending and does not resist the knowing. Dorothea looked at Calvin's chair. She thought about what he had written in the margins of that composition notebook. Those small, precise notes that had tracked the evidence of his son's choices with the careful attention of a man who had spent his life paying attention to things that mattered. She thought about the energy it had taken in those last months to maintain that level of attention, to hold grief and love and fear and resolution all at once and still make the right phone calls and sign the right documents and trust the right people. She thought about what he had written to her. Love does not mean surrender. She had read those words in a diner booth days ago and felt them as instruction. She felt them differently now, sitting in her own living room with her daughter beside her and the evening coming in through the windows and the house around her exactly as it should be claimed and inhabited and hers. They were not instruction anymore. They were simply true. She had loved Calvin for 41 years, and she had loved Brendan for 41 years. And she had loved this house and this life and this version of herself that believed in the goodness of the people closest to her, and none of that love had required her to disappear into it. She had believed for most of her life that loving well meant making yourself smaller when necessary, smoothing things over, choosing peace over the discomfort of truth. She understood now that it was not what those things required. It was what she had added to them out of her own desire to be needed, to be uncomplicated, to be the person in every room who did not cause trouble. Calvin had not loved her that way. He had loved her as someone worth protecting, worth the enormous effort of his dying months, worth the careful architecture of the flash drive and the ledger and the trust amendment. He had loved her as a person with agency, with capacity, with the right and the ability to handle the truth. She intended going forward to love herself the same way. Wynn came in from the kitchen with the coffee pot and refilled everyone's cups without asking. Lenora was at the dining room table with a folder making notes in her neat handwriting. Frederick had sent a text that morning to say he was available for whatever was needed. Midge had stood at the end of Dorothea's driveway with a key that Calvin had entrusted to her years ago, because Calvin had understood that protecting someone you love sometimes means building systems that outlast your own presence. Dorothea had not done this alone. She had never been doing it alone, not really, even on the Sunday morning when she stood on her own porch with a suitcase at her feet and a key that would not turn, and a house full of people who had decided she was easier to remove than to respect. Even then, the things Calvin had built were already in place, waiting for her to find them. She set her coffee cup down on the side table and looked around her living room. At the photograph straightened in the hallway she could see from here. At the lamp that cast a warm circle over the chair by the window. At her daughter who had flown across the country without being asked, because some people know when to show up. The house was hers. It had always been hers. And now she knew in a way she would not forget what that meant. It did not mean the absence of difficulty. It did not mean the permanent resolution of everything that had broken. Brendan was still her son, and the road between them was long and uncertain, and would require more honesty than either of them had yet managed. Sylvia was still out there recalibrating. The legal process had many steps remaining, and none of them would be simple. But the house was hers. The key in her pocket turned the lock. The people in these rooms had chosen to be here. And outside the window of 14 Elderberry Lane, the October light was going gold over the neighborhood where Calvin Hargrove had built something worth protecting, and Dorothea Hargrove was home.